There are a number of traps or layers of deception that I see people falling into in discussing the reaction to Greta Thunberg lately. One of them is to say that the supposed carbon threat is unimportant and we should focus on Sweden's real problem, supposedly. But the central problem of Sweden, as I see it, is the demonization of youth. And anybody who's seeking a means of making people young again is, discredited and made to look bad. This includes both the young and those who like to be young. This is through carbon dioxide. I looked up, because of this recent controversy, whether there was any association between carbon dioxide and rejuvenation. And surprisingly enough, I found that carbon dioxide is a beauty treatment. It's used to what they call rejuvenate skin on both the face and the female reproductive organs. This is very important symbolically, as it seems to me, because Sweden is like many other industrialized countries in that they have a problem with lack of youth. People are getting married too late, aren't having enough children, and aren't getting access to any means of living longer. So therefore, the natural population is shrinking, and they're reduced to stealing people from other countries in order to maintain the population, perhaps more than they want at this point, but don't have much of an alternative laid out thus far. This ties directly into Greta Thunberg because people are being attacked simply for being young. This is the number one psychological method of attack, I think, and yet they can't identify, or at least we don't identify as a society, the mechanism. Even though subconsciously people want to cut Greta Thunberg slack somehow. They should say, well, we'll allow her a platform because she's been through a lot, she's suffered. And the reason she's suffered is because she's attacked just for being young, as many other people are. At a young age, she acquired, through apparently emotional trauma, which is a surprise to me, because I looked this up only because of this recent talk, that emotional trauma can be a cause, apparently, of OCD and depression and autistic spectrum disorders, apparently. So she developed all these disorders after being exposed to all this kerfuffle about the greenhouse effect, and then became a greenhouse agitator. So this is a process like what has been called Stockholm Syndrome. Perhaps not the term we should use in this case, because it is another trap to make you look prejudiced against somebody, I think, because trauma bonding occurs practically everywhere. If they are the same, then perhaps we shouldn't even use the term for Stockholm Syndrome, because it doesn't just happen in Stockholm. But ironically, Greta is from Stockholm. So there's this tripwire in your head that, okay, she's exhibiting a Stockholm Syndrome, but I can't say that because I'll look prejudiced if I do, and perhaps justifiably so, but we'll call it trauma bonding. What happens in this case is that the victim is reduced to an infantile state. Childhood, in this case, however, becomes the ultimate mental double bind trap, because if you're attacked for being a child and you regress to an infantile state, that's really got to mess with your head. If you're giving this message, this never explicitly spelled out message that you're wrong and bad just because you're a child. How evil can you get? And yet that is the message we hear over and over again, it seems to me, as subtext in all these scandals that make the press about how powerful, rich, evil people abuse. There's usually a youth involved in it somewhere, because it seems to me youth is the one thing they can't get and openly display if they get it. Perhaps they have some means of making themselves young again, but unlike wealth or fame or getting away with crimes, they can't openly show it to the public, because then the public would know that the means of becoming young again are available and have been withheld. Even though subconsciously, on the down low, underneath the surface message, that's the more or less the message that's being put out. There's several ways that we have these self-destructive spokespeople recruited, and they're very much on the same issues, connected ones. One is cloning, where you get a twin to say that cloning is bad, even though he's a twin and he loves being a twin. And they're essentially the same thing. Cloning is just twinning with a time delay. And in some cultures, even up until fairly recently in history, if twins were born, they would kill one of them just out of sheer prejudice. Yet you have a twin saying cloning is bad, and I'm getting hundreds of thousands of views. The other one is to have someone with an autistic spectrum disorder say there's nothing wrong with me, I don't need to be healed, even though people with these disorders typically have higher rates of unemployment and high rates of suicide, and if the Greta Thunberg case is right, have been put in this position through emotional abuse as one cause among others. If we are to believe Greta Thunberg in her saying that Asperger's is her superpower, there's nothing wrong with her, yet she's making all these horrible judgments and promoting all these evil agendas that were once thrust upon her, then she is either a victim or a supervillain. If she's got a superpower and she's doing these evil things, then she's a supervillain. And even if it came around through trauma bonding, we shouldn't let our guard down in dealing with that. It's like the James Bond mistake, ironically. He meets someone he assumes is a victim of trauma bonding. He does James Bond. In the movie, the world is not enough. Ironically, she's a pipeline builder, so she's in the oil and climate change business too. But he thinks that she isn't bad, as he often makes the mistake in these movies, because she's a victim of trauma bonding. Of course, she turns out to be the villain in the whole thing. It's a big mistake to make, and one we have to try to avoid ourselves. The organization Greta works for is very ironically called We Don't Have Time, and that is a central problem. We aren't pursuing means of people keeping young, giving them more time in their lives, the fundamental factor of making a better life, giving people something to strive for and know that at least the next generation might have a better life than the one before. There's a point in a rich developed country where you say, what's the point? I can't have a better life than my parents. All I got is a house, a car, and a refrigerator. If that's all there is, then what do we have to look forward to? And that seems to me the problem when you get to have a developed country like Sweden and Japan and the other European and North American countries. We aren't pursuing and admitting the real way in which we don't have time and what's at the root of this abuse.